All right, sorry I was a minute or two late. A call with Discovery Channel people that I just couldn't get them off of the phone. You ever have that happen? Like, look, I'm telling you, I really got to go broadcast now. Let's get the Benny going. There's too much silence. Silence! And here comes Miles. Didn't even have to get the music going, and here's Miles. All right, hey everybody. There we go. Give me 1 second while I pour myself a drink, etc. Miles will keep you entertained, I believe. Yep.
Benny Goodman, ladies and gentlemen, the man with the torrid clarinet and the even more torrid band who purveys assorted rhythms, all danceable, in the urban room of the Congress Hotel in Chicago. And first of all, one of Irving Berlin's greatest hits, Blue Skies.
Miles. Hey, everybody. Yeah, Miles is going to be giving the talk tonight. Miles has been studying up on the Underground Railroad in Chicago. All right, I just could not get this place off the phone. Yeah, I heard it was on Discovery last night on the Expedition Files. I don't get Discovery, so I haven't seen it. Hey, Bridget. Hey, Laura. Hey, Mary Jo. Hey, Laura. Good to see you. Kathy, Geraldine, Sue, Marie, Timothy. Hey, everybody. Hey, Timberly, Kristen, etc. Hey, Susan, April, Vicky. Anybody I might have missed up there? Sorry, hectic evening. Alright, let's see. I got everything set up at Miles. Think I do. Hey, everybody. Welcome along. Hey, Michelle. Hey, Timothy. Hey, Susan. Hey, Diane. Hey, Susan. I understand I was on the Discovery Channel Expedition Files last night. That's the one I filmed in L.A. I remember a couple of walking tours out there. Hey, Lori.
All My Heart.
No, Martin, this is definitely not a time travel pub crawl. Miles. Hey, Wolfie. And Miles is up here. Hey, Grandma Belle. Still with Uncle Dave? Hey, Matt. The Above Ground Railroad, the Chicago. I haven't really done a whole thing on it. Miles, how did you get your head all wet? What have you done? Why is your head all wet? I'm gonna go get a towel. I know you love getting dry. Okay, Miles, you're about to get dried. I know you love that. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Oh, he loves getting dried. You'd think. See if I can fix that up a little. Miles.
Way back and gets a lot of rhythm out of Walk, Jenny Walk. Benny Goodman and his orchestra.
Miles, aw, purr, purr, purr. We're gonna let Benny do another tune here before we get started properly. He's kinda... Miles, you skipped ahead. Ariana over on Twitch. Good to see you. Hey, Chris. Hey, Debbie. Miles, I'm gonna need you to let me do some work here in a minute, okay? Hey, Janice. He's purring and purring here, though. Hey, Brandy. Yeah, we got Miles here purring away. Hey, Cindy. Hey, Donna. Matt, next Roseville tour, I have to check what my calendar's like. I got a lot of stuff coming up. It's hard to work things in this time of year, so I'm out traveling with school groups a lot. But it'll be coming up pretty soon. There will be a Find a Grave tomorrow, everybody. Hey, Jerry. Hey, Brandy, I don't know your work enough to know if we should collab or not, but hey, I'm always up to new adventures.
And they all loved it. They all loved those fast
Hey,
moves
Kitty.
played by Benny Goodman. And now another one just in the same vein. Rosetta.
I got a school group tomorrow, but I got time enough before they get here to do Find a Grave. My y'alls. I'm gonna need you to start getting down now, okay, Miles? We're gonna let Benny Goodman do one more tune here. I got off to a little bit of a late start. Couldn't get some people off of the phone. Well, Miles. Oh, thanks, Casey. Miles, I'm gonna need you to get down in a second. Will you look at that? Miles. All right. Cracking up at Miles' antics. We'll look at him now. Oh yeah, Miles, show him your... It's probably obscene under various new laws. Sarah, the YouTube is youtube.com/Adam Seltzer. All right, that'll be Mr. Davis wrapping it on up. So that means it is time for us to start properly. Welcome along, everybody. I'm Adam Seltzer from Mysterious Chicago Tours. With me, as always, is Miles. Party on, Miles. He's partying on. So, all right. So, I've been a tour guide and historian here in Chicago for over 20 years now, author of such books as Mysterious Chicago, The Book, H.H. Holmes' The True History of the White City Devil. You might have seen me on Expedition Files on Discovery Channel just last night. I have not seen it, but I hear it was pretty good. Smart Aleck's Guide to American History, Flickering Empire, How Chicago Invented the U.S. Film Industry. Though more so than any of those particular books tonight, one of the biggest sources for tonight's stuff is Black Chicago's First Half Century by Christopher Robert Reed, who was a professor at Roosevelt. For some of these stories, I went through his papers. Professor Reed, if you are out there, your handwriting is even worse than mine. I wasn't sure that was even possible. So what we're talking about today is the days when Chicago was referred to by downstate papers as a cesspit of abolitionism. Sometimes a sinkhole of abolitionism, which is being a little bit generous to us. There was a very robust pro-slavery contingent in Chicago at the time, but Chicago was known as Abolitionist Chicago throughout the Confederacy. We had a very tight-knit group of abolitionists and Underground Railroad workers here in Chicago, and what I've tried to do is find as many of these stories as I can for this particular tour. But the trouble is, the Underground Railroad was operating illegally. They tended not to keep very good paperwork. There are lots and lots of anecdotes, but rarely do we have really good verifiable information. There's one particularly great story from 1848. This came up in one of the abolitionist newspapers at the time. There was a story about a guy who broke away from slavery and came up to Chicago, a guy known only as Charlie. He lived in Chicago for a while, then wrote back to his enslaver, said, I made a big mistake by escaping. I didn't know how good I had it back there. If you'll take me back, no strings attached, I will tell everybody else why it's such a bad idea to escape. And the enslaver said, yes, come on back. So he went back into slavery and then immediately called a meeting, supposedly to tell them why they shouldn't escape, and instead told them exactly how to escape. This was the kind of story that went around in the press quite a bit at the time, but it's very difficult to verify things like this. We don't have enough primary source data, enough proper names to look up. Things like this, I'm sure, did happen, but a lot of this stuff we have to kind of take as kind of anecdotal evidence. So the southern newspapers were full of just the opposite, of people escaping and genuinely believing they never should have done it. Well, let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start in some of Chicago's earliest days, at least as a proper city, in the 1830s. This is the grave at Graceland Cemetery of Philo Carpenter, shown here in a bust by Laredo Taft, who also did the Eternal Silence statue, which is just down the hill beyond the grave. Now, Philo, of course, came to Chicago by canoe in about 1832, right at the same time that General Winfield Scott and his soldiers arrived on a ship called the Great Western. Now, I'm not sure if it was the same Great Western exactly that was still going around 15 and 20 years later, but there was a ship called the Great Western that Philo Carpenter was definitely associated with. See, Philo Carpenter was one of the founding members of the Chicago Anti-Slavery Society, and he was definitely a worker on the Underground Railroad. He was still able to reminisce about this decades after slavery had ended. He lived to a ripe old age. But one thing he would work with was a ship, a steamship called the Great Western, captained by a guy named Captain Walker, who, at great risk to himself, was only too happy not to notice that when he sailed away from Chicago, he had several new black crew members. He also was only too happy not to notice that after he docked in Detroit, right near Hamilton, Ontario, he no longer had those guys in his employ. This got him in a lot of trouble. At one point, he had the letters SS for slave stealer branded onto his hand. But there was also fantastic stories about him just ripping into people who tried to stop him from doing this. How many people he might have helped escape, we don't really know. With Philo Carpenter, it's sometimes estimated that it was as many as 300 people. He even is said to have had a farm up in the North Woods, which is probably about where I am now here in Rogers Park, where he had like a timber farm where he would keep people employed until such time as he could get them onto the Great Western and get them further away. Now, by this time in the 1850s, there were black laws in Illinois. Even though we weren't a slave state, there were things like black people were expected to put up a large bond before they could move to the state. Though it's generally, people like Philo Carpenter would later reminisce about this and say that those laws were never really enforced in Chicago. They're probably giving themselves a little bit too much credit, but certainly that was Chicago's reputation. A lot of people escaped to here, and rather than going on to Canada, just stayed here. One good example of this is a guy by the name of Joseph Henry Hudlin, who built what is sometimes said to be the first frame house owned by a black man here in Chicago, which would have been right about here on State and Plymouth, in what is now approximately the South Loop area. He is presently interred over here at Graceland Cemetery. Now, his actual grave is a little bit behind this one. He's actually got a marker in the plot next door to his. This is his actual grave plot, which the lot record just says base for marker. But much of his family was buried in another cemetery. They never got around to actually putting up a monument here. He's actually in the next place over. Now, Joseph Hudlin, there are a number of different stories as to how exactly he came to Chicago. There's also a couple of different pictures going around. The one that you usually see is one that they held in the Board of Trade. This might be his son. I've never been really convinced that this is Joseph and not Joseph Jr. But there are various stories of how he escaped slavery in Kentucky or Virginia. The most simple of which is that he wandered onto a ship, a steamship that was going up the river, put on a chef's hat, and just pretended he was a chef on the ship. Just when cooked whatever came up, managed to operate under the radar for a while. And then when the ship got to Illinois, it docked, and he left. Just as simple as that. Made his way to Chicago. So it was probably a little bit more complicated than that. In some versions, he'd been working as an enslaved person on ships going all over the place for quite a while. But at some point, he made his way to Illinois and just left. Found his way to the first Board of Trade in Chicago, became the janitor at the Board of Trade, and kept that job for about 40 years. After his death in the 1890s, his son took over. So there was the janitor at the Board of Trade was a guy named Joseph Hudlin for something like 80 or 90 years. Now, as a Board of Trade janitor, he became kind of an expert on commodities trading, but never really got involved himself and ended up making more money at it than most of the people who did. This is where people would like trade grains and wheat and barley futures. So he would show up, and at the end of the day, people had brought in all these samples. He would just collect all of the samples and sell them to feed stores. Over the course of his career, it's said that he made something like $100,000 doing this. That's $100,000 in 1860s money. It's an awful lot by today's standards. But in addition to all of his janitorial work and various other ventures, he was also definitely active on the Underground Railroad. He had a brother who had escaped to Alton, Illinois, right on the Mississippi River. People who were escaping from Missouri would make their way to Alton first often. Joseph would come and meet them and take them up to Chicago. And then they would either stick around here or they would go get on the Great Western and go off to Canada or whatever other route they could find. Like, it's very interesting that he has a marker in this plot. And next to him is another person not related, as far as I could tell, to the people whose plot it actually is. A guy named Willis Montgomery. There's a typo on his marker here. 1859 is when he came to Chicago from Kentucky. Most likely, at the time, it would have been on the Underground Railroad. He was a black barber here in Chicago. He was actually born about 1829, I believe. But the actual plot that this is, we'll spin around to it up here, is Mary Ann Stevens and her daughter, Martha Stevens Gray. This was a mother and daughter who escaped from slavery in Missouri. And initially when Martha died, she was buried over in the Hudlin family plot. This one hadn't been purchased yet. Joseph had some connection to her. They were members of the same church, allowed her to be buried in his family plot until the new one could be purchased. So exactly why they put up a marker to him here and a marker to Willis is unknown, but the most obvious explanation that comes to mind is that these might be people that Joseph had helped escape from slavery on the Underground Railroad. Well, let's move back a little bit here. So this is a location where the sheriff's office was back in the 1840s. Now, back in what year was this? I want to say it was 1842. It was a place called Chapman's Building. In that year, there was a guy named Edwin Heathcock who was working in Chicago, and one of his co-workers, for whatever reason, decided to turn him in as a possible, what they called at the time, fugitive slave. Today, the more proper term now is refugee enslaved person. But he turned him in as a possible fugitive, and Edwin Heathcock was taken into jail for a while. Now, nobody came to claim him, so they had to let him go, but there was a clause in the contracts those days, a clause in the law that if you had been in jail and couldn't pay for your board, your food, you could be auctioned up to a month of indentured servitude. Now, this wasn't the same thing as a slave auction down in the South. This was up to a month of indentured servitude. However, it was close enough. It was close enough that the tight-knit abolitionist groups in Chicago were putting up signs all over, making sure that nobody was going to take advantage of this. And on the day at Chapman's Building, people gathered around with everybody kind of like, I imagine like standing there like, don't anybody dare. So the sheriff brought out Edwin Heathcock, started trying to make the auction. When nobody was bidding, he said, if there are no bids, I have to take this man back to jail. And at that point, Mahlon Ogden, who had an office across the street, looked out the window and said, I bid 2 bits, 25 cents. So the auctioneer said, all right, 2 bits, going, gone. Mahlon came outside, walked up to Edwin Heathcock and said, all right, Edwin, I've purchased your service, and I say, go where you like. So Mahlon himself was the brother of William Ogden, of Chicago's first mayor. He is now interred up over here. He had one of very few houses that survived the Great Chicago Fire. Now, there are 2 accounts of the time that he bid a quarter for Edwin Heathcock. One makes him out to be a real villain for having participated in this at all. The other treats him as a hero for averting a riot for 25 cents. Now, here's the thing, though. Both of those first-hand accounts were written by the same guy. They were both written by one of the heads of the Chicago Abolitionist Societies and an abolitionist newspaper editor, a guy named Zabina Eastman. Zabina Eastman, I think I have a picture of him. Yeah. So he published The Free West and The Western Citizen, a couple of abolitionist newspapers. They've been digitized recently. Before they had, I went through the microfilm a while ago, found this real banger of a speech by Frederick Douglass. It was a transcript of a speech that he gave in Princeton, Illinois in 1853. And I just kind of like glanced at it and thought, hey, this is a good speech. I'll just take some pictures of the screen and go look it up later. And it turned out it had never been transcribed again. This has been out of print since 1853. I've got it up on the MysteriousChicago.com webpage now. You can find it on there, except for parts that were not entirely legible. It's a real banger of a speech. He says things like, you can almost see why they didn't circulate this one around much more. He said things like, when a slave is first escaping from slavery, he would rather meet a wolf than a Christian. Better a rattlesnake than a man with a prayer book under his arms. Which may have been true, but people thought that was just terrible PR. If you said that out loud, people would get so up in arms over it. One guy who would not have gotten up in arms in it was a guy who was sometimes referred to as the president of the Underground Railroad. He's coming up here. He's buried at Oakwood Cemetery, which I believe might have been built on his land. Charles Volney Dyer. Charles Volney Dyer was a friend to... All right. This is Charles Volney Dyer. He came to Chicago as a surgeon. He teamed up with Dr. Levy Boone, later a member of the Know Nothing Party, to dissect the first murderer hanged in Chicago. Just pops up all over in Chicago history. So he had an office right about where City Hall is now. And after a couple of years as a surgeon, he retired to focus more on land dealing and also on his work on the Underground Railroad. He did a lot of anti-slavery work. How many people he might have helped escape himself is unknown. But at one point, he was in his office over here, and somebody came in and said, Dr. Dyer, that person you've been trying to help escape, the slave catchers are in town and they've got him. They've got him over at the Mansion House. So Dr. Dyer interrupted his own breakfast, got up from breakfast, and ran to the Mansion House Hotel. This is the route that he would have taken. It's all been rebuilt since the 1840s. But it would have been right over around this spot. I'll move in on a little on this here. They're right about across from the Goodman Theater. It would have been right on the other side of the Tremont House Hotel. So he came into here, found the room where the slave catchers were, and there they had the guy that he had been trying to help escape tied up. So he walked in demanding they release him, and they said, Sir, you are interfering with our domestic institutions. Dr. Dyer took his cane and shouted, well, you are interfering with my breakfast, and busted his cane over the guy's head and helping the guy escape once again. Now this... It's such an Indiana Jones line that it almost sounds like it can't be real, but it was reported very shortly after the fact, and the abolitionists of Chicago got together. They all pitched in and bought him a new cane. The cane was eventually donated to the Chicago History Society, and they've still got it. The Chicago History Museum still has it in their collection. It's not on display, but they've got it in off-site storage. I've been trying to get them to get it out for a TV show or something for a long time now. But some of the other people working downtown, there's a guy by the name of L.C.P. Freer. He has an office right about here where the Chicago Title Company is now. And is presently at Rose Hill Cemetery along with his wife, Esther Freer. Appropriately named, I think. So these guys, LCP was a lawyer first and foremost. He and his wife are known to have done some Underground Railroad work. Their children remembered them getting people dressed in their kitchen so they could send them off in disguise. But also, most of his work was through the legal side of things. For instance, back in 1846, 3 people were arrested as possible refugee enslaved people here in Chicago. 3 possible fugitives. They were taken to the jail, and Freer teamed up with his partner, who is buried right across from him now. A guy by the name of James H. Collins. I have no picture of James H. Collins, not even a drawing. Still working on that one. He's right up the hill here. But he was known as one of the more violent abolitionists. He was the kind of guy who would only vote third party, ran as a third party candidate a couple of times. But he teamed up, these two teamed up, ran to Judge Kercheval's office. Judge Kercheval had a lot of say in these kind of cases in Chicago. But he would have been right over here on State Street. And this ended up making national news. So these guys walked into the office and made a whole case that nobody in Chicago had any right to arrest people as possible fugitives because Illinois was not a slave state. As soon as you got here, nobody had any authority for something like that, so the arrest was all completely undone. Also present with them that day was Owen Lovejoy, who was later in Congress, and when accused of stealing enslaved people, he said, "Yes, I do. Write it on every leaf that trembles in the forest. Shout it from every rooftop." So what they were really doing in Judge Kercheval's office was not so much making a case, though they were. Eventually, Judge Kercheval decided, yeah, you're right, I got to let these guys go. But by then, they had already created enough of a distraction that they were broken out of the place. There was a guy by the name of Greenbaum, later Rabbi Greenbaum, who was generally reputed as being the guy who broke the lock to the jail to bust the guys out. The next day, Collins wrote a whole letter to the editor, effectively saying that, look, if you ever see anybody in Chicago, any police officer trying to arrest an enslaved person, go ahead and shoot that guy. Because in this state, they'd be nothing more than kidnappers, and if they are kidnappers, they're not really subject to the protections of the law. The arresting officer in that case was described as a degraded, drunken wretch in the papers. And he was a guy named Henry Rhines, who lived not too far away. He lived right by the jail, which is convenient. And is presently also at Graceland Cemetery. Like, the mower passes over the just and the unjust. I've never found a picture of Henry. He died in the 1850s before most people would have pictures. But his son was named Dump Rhines, Henry Jr. He was a famous billiard player. So Henry I probably looked like this, but without the mustache. Now, he was one of Chicago's first police officers. He arrested the first murderer who ended up being hanged in Chicago, but really seemed to spend most of his time dealing with fugitive slave cases, arresting people that he thought might be escaping from slavery, even though he didn't necessarily have the authority to do this. Now, at one point, he got into a fight with a tavern keeper and shot the guy. He was taken to jail. It was initially just thought of as a fight case, but then the tavern keeper died. And then it became a manslaughter case. So Rhines was now facing a hefty prison sentence, but instead escaped from jail and got down to New Orleans. He was eventually captured in New Orleans, brought back up, but it's only been fairly recently I was able to establish that he actually did get pardoned by the governor. I have no idea how, but he did. He was back at work just a couple of years later. But there's an anecdote about him going after the Great Western. If I put it up here, we can kind of pretend it's sailing, 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 sailing away, wrong direction. But here's the Great Western. There was a time, now Rhines wasn't in office as a constable all the time. It really depended on who the mayor was. But one time, the Great Western was about to sail away. And as it was about to sail away, Henry Rhines showed up and assaulted Captain Wheeler, saying, "Do you know that you have some fugitive slaves on board this ship?" And Captain Wheeler said, "Are you a deputy of the law? Have you any authority to make an arrest here?" And Officer Rhines said, No, I don't really have the authority. So the captain just said, "Then you're a damned rascal," and sailed away, while people like Philo Carpenter and Charles Volney Dyer cheered from the shore. That's how it was going at the time. Move up here just a little. Now, also, right here at the Sherman House, the Sherman House Hotel stood right where the Thompson Center is now, the new Google headquarters. It's all currently covered up. But at the time, in the 1850s, it looked about like this. Move that up a bit. But in there was a barber shop that was run by a guy named Louis Isbell. Now, Louis Isbell would later claim to be the first black man in Chicago. he apparently didn't count Jean-Baptiste Pontoussaint. But he was certainly a very early black settler here in Chicago. While running the barber shop, he got to know everybody. He cut Abraham Lincoln's hair, he cut Senator Douglas's hair. And he had an awful lot of stories. He said that Lincoln himself had asked him to start recruiting soldiers for the Civil War, and eventually tried to get a pension based on this. But recruiter was not really a job that was open to black men in the U.S. Army at the time, so it wasn't in an official capacity. We can verify his service. It was widely reported in the press at the time. He tried to get a pension for it. I'm still trying to give him a gravestone. It wasn't official service, but I feel like somebody in the Senate ought to be able to pull some strings and get it to count. Now, he himself had said it would have enlisted at least 33 people just on this one day to go off and fight in the war. But this is a few years ahead, getting ahead of ourselves here. And cover a little bit of the 1840s. In the 1840s, one of the oldest guys in town, though not as old as he claims to be, was David Kennison, who was eventually buried in the Old City Cemetery. There's a plaque here saying that he was the last survivor of the Boston Tea Party, which is almost certainly not true. There's even notes in his pension file say don't listen to a word of this guy. But people liked having a Revolutionary War veteran in early Chicago, even if they had to have known on some level he wasn't really on the level. But he did use his status in order to promote the anti-slavery cause. They would take him out to free soil meetings, and he would make a little speech and then say, "Make your country free and abolish slavery." He would say things such as, "When I fought for the freedom of America, I wasn't just fighting for the white people," which, he may have been a con artist, but at least he was using his powers for good. But things changed considerably here about 1850. It seems like I might be missing a video here. No, I'm not. Here it is. We're going to go right to where the old City Hall was. There were several different City Halls. This is the one that was here in 1850, was in the middle of what is now State Street. See if we can get a better line on this. The 1850 edition of City Hall. It would have been right about there. So in 1850 came the Fugitive Slave Law. Now, previously, James H. Collins could go up in the press and say, "Listen, nobody has any right to arrest people that they think are fugitive slaves here in Chicago." But the Fugitive Slave Law changed all of that. It made it not only mandatory for them to be arrested here, but also had loopholes that you could have driven a truck through that made you be able to arrest pretty much any black person that you saw. James Collins made a big speech about this, what they was called the Colored Citizens Group, who came in and passed resolutions. And James Collins shouted, "Political death and damnation to the base, bad men who aided in the passage of this infernal law." And it was initially determined in Chicago that whatever had been decided, authorities in Chicago would not be required to arrest people. Now, the next day, I think Senator Douglas came and said, no, they're just going to have to. Senator Douglas got into a lot of trouble over this kind of thing. But this is a resolution that was passed by the black citizens of Chicago saying, "Resolved that in the language of the father of his country, General Washington, resistance to tyrants is obedience to God. That we will stand by our liberty at the expense of our lives and will not consent to be taken into slavery, nor permit our brethren to be taken. Resolved that the passage of this infamous fugitive slave law is another glaring instance of northern subserviency to the slaveholding dictation, being nothing less than establishing a hunting ground for slaveholders and kidnappers on free soil." So right away, this made things a lot harder for abolitionists in Chicago. Well, one of the judges here was a guy by the name of George Manier. He lived right here on Michigan Avenue, right where the CVS is now. And here is, this is his wife, Anne Manier. I have a better picture of her, I think. And there's one of him. But he had gotten involved in any number of these cases. But they had used their place on Michigan Avenue as a stop on the Underground Railroad on several occasions. People would be put up there until they could be put on the Great Western, which at the time would have been pulling up really right across the street. But in 1851, soon after the Fugitive Slave Law went into effect, a guy by the name of Moses Johnson was arrested in Chicago. Somebody had taken out a warrant. All that you had to do in those days is if you had a slave labor camp down south, you could swear out a warrant saying a black man named Moses Johnson with a weird scar has just escaped from me down here. I think he's in Chicago. Go find somebody in Chicago who vaguely matched the description and say, that's the guy, and take him back. So a guy named Moses Johnson was arrested. There was a warrant out. But Mr. Manier managed for there to be a trial. They had him held at what was called the Saloon Building, which stood right about here on LaSalle Street now, right about on Lake Street, Lake and LaSalle. But Manier had found some loopholes in the law. And in the middle of it, he said, all right, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, probably gentlemen of the jury, here before you stands Moses Johnson. We have a warrant here for the arrest of a fugitive slave named Moses Johnson, described here as copper-colored. Before you stands this Moses Johnson. Would you describe this man as copper-colored? This led to a very long debate, really a rather dehumanizing and problematic one in its own way, about exactly how Moses Johnson, who stood before them, ought to be described. Now, this went on for a couple of days. They had Johnson held in the Saloon Building, and guarding his cell, guarding the doorway, was Henry Rhines, the famous slave catcher of the day. So by this time, he had already been pardoned by the governor. He wasn't given as much authority as he had had before, but he was still put to work in cases like this, and in this case had him guarding the door. But, true to his description in the New York papers, he was drunk off his ass as he guarded the door. The story went around in the papers like the next day that the person who lived next door had come home and found that Rhines was accidentally guarding his door, not the right one. So as he approached his own residence, Rhines pulled out a gun and said, "Stop, say the password or I'm going to shoot you." And the guy said, "No, this is where I live. You're supposed to be guarding the place next door." At which Rhines said, "Nope, you got to say the password or I'm going to shoot you dead." And the guy said, "Okay, what's the password?" And Rhines said, "The password is Fillmore. Say Fillmore or I'm going to shoot you." So the guy said Fillmore, and Rhines let him pass. It's such a Bugs Bunny trick that it almost seems like it can't be true, but it was reported very early on in the process. It's not an anecdote from years later. It's an anecdote that was printed hours later. And in any case, the jury eventually agreed that Moses Johnson did not match the description that was in the warrant, and he was free to go. This was a loophole that lawyers would use throughout the next decade or so while the fugitive slave law was in effect. And Mr. Manier is now at Graceland Cemetery. He became a judge soon after this. Was involved in a great many cases. I'm going to move around a little bit here. Move up a few years. Now, by the 1850s, any political discussion became a discussion on slavery sooner or later. At the time, the Missouri rule was still in effect, that slavery would be in new states that were south of the southern border of Missouri, but not in northern states. But in 1854, Senator Douglas of the Lincoln-Douglas debates introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which ruled that new territories would have a vote, no matter where they were, as to whether or not they would be slave states or free states. Possibly he didn't anticipate that people were going to send militia groups to these states to make sure they became slave states by any means necessary. But this was a highly controversial thing even at the time in 1854. In fact, it really split all of the parties in two. Whether you were a Democrat or a Whig the year before didn't matter anymore by 1855. You were either pro-Kansas or anti-Kansas after that. So, in defense of this speech, Stephen Douglas gave a talk right here where the courthouse now stands. At the time, it was a marketplace, and got absolutely heckled back to the Stone Age. The hall was one of the largest in the city, and it was used frequently. Here, Stephen A. Douglas in September 1854 attempted to speak on the Kansas-Nebraska bill and was forced to desist. The audience became too noisy and threw rotten eggs, chips, and other things at the little giant. Nearly everybody got another man's hat. And this was reported, at the time, too. Towards the end of the scene, Douglas drew a letter from his pocket and attempted to read it. It was a big letter saying, "We're going to kick your butt if you show up here," threatening personal violence. The press said it is needless to say that no such letter was ever written, at least by any reliable person here. And this got to be an absolute mess. At the same time, there was another fugitive slave case with a guy by the name of Turner. And at the time, every news story like this that came out, people just used it as an excuse to talk about all of these anti-free speech people in Chicago who tried to shout Senator Douglas down. Now, among those who tried to shout him down that day was Louis Zisbel. Right after making this speech, Senator Douglas went to get his hair cut and kind of approached sheepishly, saying, "You're probably mad at me, aren't you?" And Louis Zisbel agreed that yes, he was. "You have said awful things about my people." But they had a little chat and apparently managed to smooth things over a bit. I'll also say right over here was the Sands, neighborhood nearby there. Neighborhood generally known for its brothels in the 1850s. But as I mentioned, a lot of militia groups were formed to go off to Kansas and Nebraska to try to make sure that they were slave states. But there were also armies of abolitionists doing the same. Now watch out, there's a little bit of, there's some language here that we wouldn't use anymore. But this is one of the Springfield papers said, "We were favored on Thursday with a sight of the class of men the agitation managers are sending to Kansas to battle for freedom. 75 drunken rowdies from the Sands of Chicago passed through our town, accompanied by a quota of," slur for black people, "on their way to Kansas. This gang of bawdy house bullies were uniformed like a crew of pirates, as the character is generally depicted on the boards of the city theaters. As these fellows supposed they had engaged in a piratical campaign, they deemed it necessary to dress the character. A more ruffianly-looking gang we have never seen before." Man, lighten up, guys. But the Springfield papers were awfully conservative about these kind of things. Now, among the people who were supplying these groups that were going through Springfield on their way from the Sands to go fight against slavery in Kansas, Horace White was eventually the editor of the Chicago Tribune and their war correspondent during the Civil War, one of the first people to say, "Listen, if we don't use this war to resolve the slavery issue, we're going to fight the same thing next year." He was eventually brought before Congress. He had been head of the Kansas Committee, and in that capacity ran a lot of firearms to John Brown, the radical abolitionist, as pictured here, who had decided to end slavery all by himself, starting a revolution. One of his friends was John Jones, who is also here at Graceland, not too far away from Horace White, in fact. John Jones and his wife were the first black couple to get really rich in Chicago. They lived here on Plymouth, a couple of blocks above where Joseph Henry Hudlin would have been. In a whole neighborhood that didn't look anything like this in the 1850s. Then at an office up over here. Now, he got rich running a cleaning store, but also had an office and a tailoring shop. And this is an ad from Frederick Douglass's newspaper. He would actually take out ads in the paper saying, "If you have escaped from slavery, come see my General Intelligence office up on Dearborn in Chicago. We will set you up with loans. We will set you up with jobs." Now, he himself had come to Chicago. He was a free black man in Kentucky. Came up here, was taught to read by L.C.P. Freer, who worked with him quite a bit. And at one point in 1852, he was a free black man in Kentucky. Came up here, was taught to read by L.C.P. Freer, who worked with him quite a bit. And at one point in 1852, together. Now, this was something abolitionists didn't usually like to do. By purchasing somebody to free them, it was just acknowledging the validity of the institution. But it would do in a pinch. Albert Petit, the guy that they freed, may have been a relative of his wife, Mary Richardson Jones. Now, the story that Mary had to tell over and over throughout her life, they had used their place as a stop on the Underground Railroad for years themselves. Now, what the story she had to tell the most was the day that John Brown showed up. Now, John Brown had been raising an army to end slavery himself. One day he showed up at the house with what she described as 40 or 50 of his fighters. And she told John, "I don't know if I want these guys coming into the house. These look like the toughest guys she had ever seen." But John said, "Well, what else can we do? You hide them here a little while. I'll go raise money to get them up to Canada." So she brought them in there and sent somebody who was about John's size out to State Street to be measured for a new suit, and believed that that was the suit that John was wearing when he was hanged eventually after his raid on Harper's Ferry failed. That was the story she told over and over. If you read like one-page articles about John and Mary Richardson Jones, usually they'll say they didn't approve of John Brown's plan to end slavery with a revolution. The truth from their actual statements themselves is more, they didn't think it would work. It's a bit more like that. But among the people that he went to find, that John went to find, well, he got money from George Manier, but also, if we were to put anything nice about this guy on May Day, his company was later known for cracking down on organized labor. But Allan Pinkerton had come to Chicago specifically to work on the Underground Railroad. And in that capacity, he's learned a lot of his detecting skills. It wasn't really until after his death that his company became better known for cracking down on organized labor. But he was one of the people who put up money to get John Brown and his friends out of the place. So was George Manier. But one of the people who would later work with Pinkerton during the Civil War was a guy whose grave has just recently been marked here at Graceland. Like, since I started doing this. A guy by the name of Seth Payne. He's pictured here over on the left while working at Antietam with the Union Army during Civil War. He worked with Pinkerton and Antietam, and one of his main jobs was trying to break enslaved people out of the city prisons. They were being held there for trying to escape, really just kind of for political reasons, until they had passed enough laws that they could put them into the army as well. But Seth Payne was an interesting guy. He was not only an abolitionist here in Chicago, he also operated a spiritualist bank where they employed spirit mediums so they could supposedly talk to Alexander Hamilton about credit matters. Wonder if that'll still work. No, they need more paperwork than that these days. He was also a feminist years before that was popular. He was a vegetarian years before that really hit the West, and operated a whole place up in Lake Zurich where he made one of his homes. They recently were digging out the foundations of one of his buildings and found what may have been hiding places used in the Underground Railroad days. I think more likely they were probably just used for potatoes. People who were escaping from slavery didn't usually need to hide in cellars around here. But his grave was just recently marked. That was put in place by Nancy Schumann, who recently wrote a whole biography of Seth Payne, The Anointed One, the untold story of Seth Payne, Midwest abolitionist. Nancy Schumann, you might remember we did a couple of events with her about a year or two ago when her book came out. We're going to skip a little ways here. I'm going over time. Well, let's not go that far. Right around here was a brothel. And right around the corner from it, where the Sears Tower now stands, was an armory, which was where they held a person who had escaped by the name of Eliza Grayson. Now, Eliza had escaped from slavery in Nebraska after it was made a slave state by those armies after the Kansas-Nebraska Act. There weren't that many enslaved people ever in Nebraska, but she was one of them. Escaped, got a job in the brothel over here, and spoke a little bit too freely about her situation. So some of the people who worked in that place got word to Mr. Knuckles, her enslaver. I won't put up a picture of him. But when he came to arrest her, a guy by the name of Calvin DeWolf, with help of a Chancellor Jenks, managed to hold her in the armory. They arrested both her and Mr. Knuckles until they could figure out what to do, and really was just a cover for Eliza to escape. She appears to have escaped to Canada. Nobody really knows what happened to her after that, but there's still a park named after Mr. Knuckles in Nebraska. In 1860, a lot of things began to change. After the Civil War began, after Lincoln was elected. But right after Lincoln was elected, a lot of the states started to really crack down on things. A lot of the southern states were starting to secede, and to try to keep them from doing so, a lot of people started cracking down. Like the U.S. Marshal in Chicago started a real crackdown on refugee and enslaved people in Chicago. So LCP Freer, out of his office right here, took out an ad to the old Liberty Guard. The new United States Marshal is inaugurating a reign of terror among our colored population. Do you wish to take any step in the matter? matter. If you do, you are invited to meet at my office this Friday evening at 7:30 number 51 Clark Street. None but live men are invited. So they organized a whole group. They managed to distract the U.S. Marshal, I assume, where they gathered as many people as wanted to at Quinn Chapel, and then helped them get on a bus or a train by then out of the city. But I have moved a little bit over time here. So we are going to be wrapping up for now. I'm not sure what we do next week, so I don't have anything upcoming to promote right now, but I'm sure we'll come up with something. Thanks, everybody, for joining me. I've got to finish getting ready for a school group, but first, here's a little bit more Benny.
Chicago. And now Benny Goodman's arrangement of The Bugle Call Rang.
And we'll just hang out like we always do. Thanks for joining me, everybody. So thanks, everybody. I could go on longer on this one. There's a lot of other stories about this. Thank you, Cindy. Mike gets LCP freer, usually. Thanks. Thanks, Marita. Thanks, Diane. Maria, I bet I can come up with more for part 2 of this. We didn't even cover on some of the guys in Graceland, even. Yeah, we'll do some more of these. A lot of stuff at Oak Woods, too. Thanks, Jim. Thank you, Lori.
And that would put rhythm in the feet of a wooden Indian. That was the Bugle Call Rang.
Thanks, Katie. Walking tours in May. I'm sure I'll do some walking tours in May, but I gotta see what my schedule is like. Hey, Wolf. Hey, Lisa. Hey, thanks. We're still dealing with History Channel stuff and Discovery Channel stuff. More TV stuff. Thanks, Becky. Thanks, Susan. Octavio, I haven't gotten too far into Andor Season 2 yet. It's very slow, you know.
To tell you all about it.
How far from Graceland is Clark and Oak? Quite a ways, couple miles. Oak is about 1,000 north, and Graceland is at 4,000 north, so 2-3 miles. Hey, Kathy. Good night, Wolfie. You must in fact be yourself.
We had to have someone new, a dancer duo here in Hollister. Someone started trucking. As soon as the news got round, the folks downtown came up to Hollister. Everybody's trucking. It didn't take long. East on the High Avenue and at Park Avenue and it's
All over town.
you see them shuffling, trucking along. It spread like a forest blaze, became a craze and sang to Harlem now. Everybody's trucking.
All right, thanks, Charles, for the donation. And Debbie, from there, if you're going to take a car there, it's a lot easier to just hop on Lakeshore Drive up to Graceland. Be there in about 10 minutes. Thank you, Chuck. Chuck, appreciate that. Or join the Patreon. Always cool stuff on the Patreon.
Goodman presents
Probably got to
On
add
the
something
Alamo.
tomorrow, don't I? Don't let me forget that. I got a school group. We got Find a Grave tomorrow. It's going to be a really good Find a Grave. So's you know. Good night, Tracy. Cake is a good idea right now. I'm feeling very tired. It was a busy day. You might have seen on the story I went and hung out at Mike's place a bit. Met Mike's cat, Hetty. Take it sleazy, Lacey. Take it easy, but take it. You can fall behind on the Patreon quite easily. There's a lot of content that comes your way on that thing. I did a few months in advance, because I can't remember what's coming out right now. I think we're on Jerry Dunn, who was a notable gambler in Chicago history. Bad Jerry Dunn. Baddest man in the whole damn town in his day. I always thought it was whole downtown that bad Leroy Brown was the baddest man in. Happy May Day, Octavio. Patreon comes a little later these days. They do it a little differently now. What a day. What a day, what a day, what a day. They had that on a mixtape my mom made me for me when I was like 4. So I wouldn't have thought Damn Town would be on there.
Eeny, meeny, miny, mo.
Mr. Crosby sings it. Oof. Been a long day over here. I got a school group tomorrow. Still more to do today, too. Give it another minute or so. Thank you, Karen. That's the whole song. Sunday, Milwaukee, Cubs versus Brewers in Wrigley North. All right. Sounds like a good run. I got stuff as well. You know, as naming rights stuff goes, American Family Field is a great name for a ballpark, even if it does happen to be an insurance company. Alright, you guys have a good time tailgating. I'm going to go finish getting ready for tomorrow's tour. Taking an orchestra around. We're going to IIT. We can talk about all the great jazz clubs that used to be there. Till they tore them down to build IIT. So, alright, thanks everybody. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago Tours, and we'll see you tomorrow for Find a Grave Friday. Until then, stay safe, stay strong.